At 0600 hours on March 23, 1943, the desert valley east of El Ghetta in southern Tunisia was still black. The cold was the kind that settled into a young man's bones through his wool overcoat and would not leave until the sun came over the eastern ridges. Frost glittered on the rocks. Somewhere out in the gloom, a coyote, or perhaps a jackal, called once and then went silent. Then the ground began to tremble. 50 German tanks, the heart of the 10th Panzer Division, came rolling out of the eastern haze in a wedge formation, their engines a low, rising thunder that the American artillerymen on the ridges had been told to expect, but had never quite been able to imagine. Behind the panzers came half-tracks loaded with motorized infantry, 88mm anti-tank guns ready to deploy, and a battalion of the 7th Bersaglieri Regiment, the feathered Italian light infantry that had earned its black plumes on a dozen battlefields. They were, by every German measure, the finest mechanized force the Wehrmacht still had on the African continent. They had broken French lines, they had broken British lines, and they had, just 5 weeks earlier, at a place called Kasserine Pass, broken American lines too. The men of the 1st Infantry Division Artillery, watching from gun pits cut into the hard Tunisian rock, had been told to hold. They had been told that this time, the Big Red One was not going to break. What happened in the hours that followed would change the way the German army talked about Americans. It would put words into the mouth of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man they called the Desert Fox, that he would write down later in his own hand. It would teach a humiliated American army that it possessed, in its field artillery battalions, something the Germans did not, something that could not be matched by any panzer division in the Wehrmacht. And it would mark the moment when the United States Army, the green American army that had stumbled ashore in Morocco the previous November, finally became the army that would march to Berlin. This is the story of how American gunners earned the respect of Erwin Rommel. It is the story of what he admitted, in writing, about them. And it is the story, told in their voices, of the men behind the howitzers. To understand what these gunners achieved, you have to understand what they were before the war found them. In 1939, the entire United States Army numbered about 190,000 men. By the historian Rick Atkinson's account, it ranked 17th among the world's armies in size and combat power, just behind Romania. Its field artillery was a quaint collection of horse-drawn pieces left over from the First World War, and many of its battalions still trained with French 75s that had fired against the Kaiser's grandfather. The men who would crew the guns at El Ghetta were, in that year, mostly civilians. They were farm boys from Iowa. They were welders from Pittsburgh. They were Polish kids from Chicago and Italian kids from the Bronx and black soldiers from segregated regiments in the Carolinas. They were college students who had never fired anything bigger than a duck gun, and they were about to inherit the most modern field artillery system the world had ever seen. The man who built that system was a quiet, slightly stooped artilleryman named Leslie J. McNair. A West Point graduate of 1904, he had served as the senior artillery training officer of the American Expeditionary Force in France during the last summer of the First World War. From the spring of 1942 onward, as the commanding general of Army Ground Forces, he held the most important job in the United States Army that almost no civilian had ever heard of. McNair did not lead troops in battle. He built the army that other men would lead. McNair did 3 things that would matter at El Ghetta. He restructured the American Infantry Division around 3 regiments and 4 artillery battalions, a lean configuration the army called triangular. He pooled additional, heavier artillery battalions at the corps level, where they could be shifted to wherever the fighting was hardest. And he gave his blessing to a revolution in gunnery that had been quietly cooking at a windswept Oklahoma post called Fort Sill since the late 1920s, the work of 2 thoughtful majors named Carlos Brewer and Orlando Ward. That revolution had a name that sounded as bureaucratic as anything in the army. It was called the Fire Direction Center. The men who worked in it called it the FDC, and it was the reason the German army, for the rest of the war, would never again take American artillery lightly. Before the FDC, every artillery battery in every army in the world fought essentially alone. A forward observer would call back to one battery of 4 guns, which would adjust onto the target by walking its rounds in. If a second battery wanted to join, it had to repeat the same process from scratch. Massing the fire of an entire battalion of 12 guns on a single target took 10 or 15 minutes, and massing a regiment or division was something only the most painstakingly prepared set-piece battles could achieve. Brewer and Ward changed all of that. Their idea was simple in principle and revolutionary in effect. Every battery would be surveyed onto a common map. A single command center, with telephones and radios to every gun, would compute the firing data for an entire battalion or regiment from a single observer's call. A lieutenant on a ridge with a pair of binoculars could, within 2 or 3 minutes, bring down the synchronized weight of 3 battalions on a single grid square. By 1940, the answer had been worked out. A year later, Fort Sill was teaching it to every newly commissioned artillery officer in the United States Army. By 1942, it was being practiced in maneuvers in Louisiana and the Carolinas. And by November of that year, it was about to be tested for the first time, in earnest, by Americans against Germans. On November 8, 1942, the largest amphibious operation in human history up to that date put 107,000 American and British troops ashore on the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts of French North Africa. The operation was called Torch. The American Center Task Force, under Major General Lloyd Fredendall, came ashore around Oran. At 0832 hours that morning, B Battery of the 33rd Field Artillery Battalion, attached to the 26th Regimental Combat Team of the 1st Infantry Division, fired the first round from a United States Army artillery piece against an enemy in the European theater of operations. The target was a Vichy French position near a coastal village called Les Andalouses. The round was a 33-pound high-explosive shell from an M2 A1 105mm howitzer. The men who pulled the lanyard did not know they were making history. They knew only that the shell had been a long time coming. Within 4 days, the French had agreed to a ceasefire. By Christmas Eve, a battery of the 36th Field Artillery Battalion fired the United States Army's newest piece of artillery, the M115 5mm gun. In its combat debut against German positions at Mejez El Bab, Allied gunners called the gun the Long Tom, an old American nickname for any long-barreled cannon. It threw a 95-pound projectile 14 miles. It would, in the months to come, become the loudest American voice in Tunisia. But before the gunners could find their voice, they would first have to be humiliated. In the second week of February 1943, Erwin Rommel, the most famous soldier in the German army, looked at the green American positions strung out across central Tunisia and saw, in his own words, an opportunity. Rommel had retreated almost 2,000 miles from El Alamein. He had lost most of his original Afrika Korps, but he had, in southern Tunisia, 2 fresh panzer divisions and the prestige of a man whom Adolf Hitler had recently made a field marshal. He looked at the Americans, and he saw boys. On February 14, the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions struck the United States 1st Armored Division at a dusty crossroads called Sidi Bou Zid. By the night of February 16, the Americans had lost 1,600 men, about 100 tanks, 57 half-tracks, and 29 artillery pieces. On February 19, in a freezing rain that turned the mountain passes into rivers of mud, Rommel pushed through Kasserine Pass itself, the gateway to the Allied supply base at Tebessa. American battalions broke. American officers were captured in their pajamas. By the night of February 20, Rommel was through the pass, and the road to Tebessa lay open. The American press, which had spent the previous 3 months trumpeting the Green Army's invincibility, fell silent. In London, Winston Churchill was reportedly told privately that the Americans might have to be pulled out of the line entirely. What stopped Rommel was not the United States 1st Armored Division, which had been shattered. It was not the United States 1st Infantry Division, which was holding a different sector entirely. It was not even the British 6th Armored Division, which was outnumbered and outgunned. What stopped Rommel was a 48-gun column of American howitzers that had just driven without sleep and almost without rest 735 miles across northwest Africa in 4 days. The man at the head of that column was Brigadier General Stafford Leroy Irwin. His friends called him Red. His soldiers called him Sir. He had been born at Fort Monroe, Virginia, in 1893, the son of an artillery general and the grandson of a Medal of Honor recipient. He had graduated from West Point in 1915, the famous class the stars fell on, alongside Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley. In civilian life, he painted watercolors and wrote poetry. In 1943, he commanded the 9th Infantry Division Artillery. On the morning of February 17, with the German offensive in its third day, Irwin received a one-line order from 1st Army Headquarters. "Move your guns to Thala." The phrase that followed was, by all accounts, simple: as fast as you can. Thala lay in the mountains south of Lekef, behind a single, narrow pass that the British 26th Armoured Brigade was holding with everything it had. Irwin's 3 battalions were scattered across western Algeria. 2 of them were nearly 700 miles from Thala by road. 1 was even farther. Irwin gave the order. The trucks rolled. For 4 days, in a column that stretched for miles along narrow Algerian roads, the gunners drove. They drove through the night with cat-eye blackout slits cut into their headlights. They drove through dawn, with frost on the windshields and the desert mountains turning pink around them. They stopped only for fuel and to relieve drivers, never to sleep. The men ate cold rations on the trucks. The howitzers, hitched behind 2.5-ton trucks the soldiers called deuce-and-a-halfs, bounced and rattled across roads that had been built by Romans and last repaired by the French Foreign Legion. By the early evening of February 21, the lead battalion of Irwin's column rolled into the village of Thala, where exhausted British tankers were brewing tea around a Sherman with a hole in its turret. Irwin had brought 48 guns. He had 36 105mm howitzers and 12 155mm howitzers. He emplaced them in a 3-mile arc behind the British armour, his gun lines exactly 1,000 yards apart, so that no single German artillery concentration could destroy more than 1 battery at a time. His fire direction centres, in tents and in stone farmhouses, plotted every yard of ground in front of them on overlay maps. The battery commanders sent forward observers up onto the hills, where they could see the road that came up from the south. That night, freezing rain and a bitter mountain wind swept across the high passes. The British, who had been close to the breaking point, were astonished by the sudden arrival of so many American guns. The senior British officer at Thala, Brigadier Charles Dunphy, later wrote that the appearance of Irwin's column had given his men a mathematical and a moral reason to keep fighting. At dawn, on February 22, 1943, the combined Allied artillery, 84 guns in all, opened fire. They fired without pause for the better part of the day. Across the front, German tank commanders heard the deep, body-shaking thuds of the 155mm guns landing in their assembly areas. The commander of the 10th Panzer Division, Major General Friedrich von Broich, listened to that sound, looked at his maps, and reached one conclusion. A fresh American infantry division must have arrived overnight. He picked up his telephone and called Rommel. Rommel listened. He had spent the previous evening at his forward headquarters, reviewing reports of stiffening resistance, of mud, of fatigue, of fuel shortages. The Americans, who had been collapsing 4 days earlier, were now firing at a rate and with a coordination he had not expected. Rommel did the calculation that any general must do at such a moment. Could the offensive still reach Tebessa before the Allies brought up enough force to surround the German spearheads? He concluded that it could not. Late in the afternoon of February 22, he ordered the offensive broken off and his divisions withdrawn through Kasserine Pass. The 9th Division Artillery had fired 1,904 rounds at Thala. They had not destroyed Rommel's forces. They had done something more important. They had convinced him that the Americans were learning faster than he had thought possible. In the days that followed, the American press recovered its voice. Eisenhower replaced Fredendall with George Patton. The 1st Infantry Division reorganized. New ammunition, new commanders, and most important, new confidence began to flow forward. Rommel himself, his health collapsing, his weight dropping, his trust in his Italian allies and his own high command at its lowest point, was ordered home to Germany on March 9th. He never returned to Africa. He would later write, in pages that his widow turned over to the British military historian Basil Liddell Hart for posthumous publication, his honest assessment of what he had seen. The Americans, he wrote, had paid a stiff price for their experience, but it had brought rich dividends. Even at that early stage, he wrote, the American generals had shown themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. He wrote that American troops could not yet, in February of 1943, be compared with the veterans of the British 8th Army. But he wrote that they had made up for their lack of experience, and these are his words, by their far better and more plentiful equipment and their tactically more flexible command. He had absorbed, in the high mountain passes of Tunisia, a lesson that the rest of the German army would relearn many times before 1945. The American gun was not the German gun. The American gunner was not, on a man-to-man basis, more skilled than the German gunner. But the American system, the network of forward observers and fire direction centers and pooled corps battalions and abundant ammunition supply was something the Wehrmacht had never built. And once it began to function in combat, it was a thing of terrible mathematical efficiency. He did not yet know what was waiting for his successor at El Guetta. George Patton took command of the United States Second Corps on March 6, 1943. He was 57 years old, profane, theatrical, deeply Christian, and a former Olympic pentathlete who had finished fifth in the modern pentathlon at Stockholm in 1912. He carried an ivory-handled Colt single-action revolver on his hip and a cavalryman's contempt for everything slow. His new corps included the 1st Infantry Division under Major General Terry Allen, the 1st Armored Division, still recovering from Sidi Bouzid, the 9th Infantry Division, and the Green 34th Infantry Division of the Iowa, Minnesota, and Dakota National Guard. Total strength, roughly 88,000 men, and the corps had 400 guns. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, had a division artillery commander whose name should be much more famous than it is. Brigadier General Clift Andrus had been born at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, in 1890. He had been commissioned into the 4th Field Artillery Regiment in 1912. His soldiers called him Mr. Chips, after the gentle Latin master in the James Hilton novel, because Andrus smoked a pipe, played chess in his command tent, read Charles Dickens in the field, and almost never raised his voice. He had taken command of the 1st Division Artillery in May of 1942. He would lead it through Tunisia, Sicily, Normandy, and the Battle of the Bulge, ultimately rising to command the entire Big Red One. After the war, he would become commandant of the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, the very place where his trade had been reinvented in the years between the wars. On the morning of March 23, 1943, Andrus was standing in a command post near the village of El Guetta in southern Tunisia. His 4 artillery battalions were emplaced across a valley about 10 miles wide, with the salt flats of Chott El Guetta to the south and the rocky ridges of Hill 336 and Hill 369 framing the killing ground. American Signals Intelligence, listening to German radio traffic the previous night, had told him to expect a counterattack at first light. Andrus had been an artilleryman for 30 years. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else on the American side, what was about to happen. When the German tanks emerged from the eastern haze at 0600 hours, they aimed straight up the valley, hoping to break the American line at the seam between the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 18th Infantry Regiment. They got their breakthrough. Tank platoons of the 10th Panzer Division ground forward through American foxholes that had been dug only inches deep into the unforgiving rocky soil. The 32nd Field Artillery Battalion, in the path of the lead panzers, was overrun. So were elements of the 5th Field Artillery Battalion, the oldest continuously serving unit in the regular United States Army, descended from the New York Provincial Company of Artillery, authorized on January 6, 1776, and first commanded by Captain Alexander Hamilton. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the panzers had punched 6 miles into the American rear, and roughly 170 Americans were prisoners. But the breakthrough was a trap, and Andrus had set it. The lead German tanks ran into a minefield in the Kedab Wadi at the base of Hill 336. Mines blew tracks. Tanks stopped. The crews dismounted to repair them under fire. American tank destroyers rolled forward to engage at point-blank range. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion came on with its M3 half-tracks mounting 75mm guns. The 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion brought up its newly issued M10 tank destroyers, an open turreted Sherman variant with a 3-inch gun. American anti-tank guns dug in on the reverse slopes opened up. And every gun in the 1st Division Artillery, plus reinforcing battalions from Corps, came down on the German formation in coordinated battalion concentrations, directed by forward observers on the high ground. Within an hour of crossing the minefield, the 10th Panzer Division had lost about 30 of its 50 tanks. By 9 in the morning, the survivors were in retreat, dragging damaged vehicles behind them. The first morning at El Guetta was over. the Americans had stopped a Panzer Division attack for the first time in the war. The Germans were not finished. Through the morning and early afternoon, the 10th Panzer reorganized. American signals intelligence intercepted the orders for a renewed assault. Andrew shifted his observation posts forward. He re-registered his guns. He had every fire direction center in the division compute prepared concentrations on the likely avenues of approach, and he waited. At 16:45 hours on March 23, the German afternoon attack came in. This time it led with infantry, 3 battalions of motorized Panzer Grenadiers, supported by the surviving tanks at the rear. They came forward in a long, well-drilled line across open ground, rifles slung, machine guns spaced at regular intervals, exactly as their training manuals prescribed. George Patton had ridden up to a forward observation post on Hill 336 to watch. With him were Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the Assistant Division Commander, and Major General Terry Allen. The 3 of them stood in a trench cut into the limestone, binoculars to their eyes, as the German line came on across the valley floor. Andrus waited until the Germans were within 1,500 yards of the American positions. Then he gave the order. Every American gun in range fired at once. They were firing high-explosive shells, set with mechanical time fuses, the M67, that detonated above the heads of the advancing infantry. The fragments came down at a steep angle. They came through helmets. They came through rifles. They came through the cloth of uniforms and the bones of the men who wore them. American forward observers, on the ridges, called corrections to the fire direction center. Each correction took 90 seconds to reach the gun line. Within 5 minutes, the entire valley floor was a moving carpet of black smoke and yellow flame, and the German line had ceased to exist as an organized military formation. Patton lowered his binoculars. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of the president, had served in the trenches in the First World War. He had seen artillery fire before, but he had never seen anything like this. Patton turned to him. The remark that came out of the Corps commander's mouth was recorded that evening by his aide and survives in the contemporary records of the 1st Division Artillery. It said, "My God, it seems a crime to murder good infantry like that." Out on the floor of the valley, an American forward observer with the 18th Infantry sent a message back to the Fire Direction Center at 6:45 in the evening. The message was 3 words long. Our artillery crucified them. That afternoon and into the next morning, American gunners walked the wounded out of the valley. They counted German bodies. They counted burned tanks. By the morning of March 25, the 10th Panzer Division had been reduced from a starting strength of about 100 operational tanks to 26. To Andrus, walking among the burned hulls in the cold dawn, this was the vindication of 2 decades of doctrinal work at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill. The Central Fire Direction Center, the firing chart, the massed battalion chute, all of it had been proven on the rocky ground east of El Getar. To understand what those gunners actually did, you have to understand the men and the machinery. The standard American divisional howitzer was the M2A1 105mm howitzer. It weighed approximately 4,980 pounds in firing position. It threw a 33-pound high-explosive shell. It had a maximum range of about 7 miles. It was crewed by 8 men. The chief of section was usually a sergeant. The gunner sat on the left side of the trail and operated the panoramic sight, setting deflection by reference to aiming stakes hammered into the ground behind the gun. The assistant gunner, on the right, set the elevation by quadrant and operated the breech block. The number 1 cannoneer rammed the round home. The number 2 and 3 cannoneers brought rounds from the ammunition pile and prepared them, cutting the time fuse with a fuse setter that looked like a small wrench, removing increments of bagged powder for shorter ranges. A recorder kept the firing log on a clipboard so that any disputed round could be reconstructed afterward. The gun fired with a sharp slapping crack and a tongue of yellow-orange flame. A pall of grey-black cordite smoke hugged the ground in the early morning damp, and the recoil sled hissed as the barrel returned to battery. After 30 rounds, the gunner's ears rang for hours. After 300 rounds, they could not hear ordinary speech for a day. After 1,000 rounds, some of them never recovered their hearing fully and would carry the war's price with them into old age. The bigger sister of the howitzer, the M1155mm howitzer, threw a 95-pound projectile, took an 11-man gun crew, and used separate loading-bagged charges that the gunners measured out by hand. The Long Tom, properly called the M1155 5mm gun, threw a similar projectile 14 miles and made a deeper, slower, more terrifying sound on impact. German prisoners taken in Tunisia and Italy described that sound as a freight train arriving from heaven. Behind the guns, every battalion had a fire direction center. It was not impressive to look at. Usually it was a tent, sometimes a stone outbuilding, occasionally just a tarpaulin stretched over a slit trench. Inside, 3 or 4 soldiers worked over a firing chart on a plywood board. They had slide rules, firing tables in canvas-covered books, the men called brown books, and grease pencils to mark the chart. They had a wired field telephone, the EE-8, with hand-cranked magneto and dry cell batteries, by which they could speak with every gun and every observer. They had, when the equipment worked, a frequency-modulated radio, the SCR-610, mounted in a half-track or a jeep. And they had, in the lieutenants and captains who supervised them, men who had been trained to compute a fire mission from a forward observer's call to rounds in the air in less than 3 minutes. By the standards of 1943, this was magic. The forward observer himself was usually a junior artillery officer, a lieutenant or a captain, with 1 or 2 enlisted men, a radio, a map, and a pair of binoculars. He went forward with the infantry. He lived in their foxholes, he ate their rations, he shared their casualties, and when he saw something that needed to be killed, he picked up the radio handset and spoke a precise, short, standardized call for fire, target description, location relative to a known reference point, ammunition and fuse recommendation. The Fire Direction Center took it from there. This was the system that broke the 10th Panzer Division at El Guetar. In the weeks that followed, the American Army rolled north. The 1st Infantry Division and the 9th Infantry Division pressed up the eastern dorsal toward the coastal plain. The British First Army drove east toward Tunis. The 8th Army, having broken the Mareth line, came up from the south. The Axis pocket shrank. On April 27, 1943, the 34th Infantry Division, the citizen soldiers of Iowa and Minnesota and the Dakotas, opened the attack on a hard piece of ground called Hill 609, the Jebel Tahent, which dominated the road network in northern Tunisia. Hill 609 was held by a regiment of German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger Regiment Barenthin, men as good as any in the German army. For 4 days, the 34th attacked. Their casualties were heavy. The hill was steep, the German fire devastating. By the morning of May 1, the 133rd and 135th Infantry Regiments had clawed their way to the summit. And then the German counterattacks began. What broke those counterattacks, again and again, was the combined artillery of the 34th and 1st Divisions, firing massed concentrations onto German assembly areas observed from the freshly captured heights. On May 1 alone, more than 2,000 shells came down on the hillsides where the German paratroopers were forming up. The counterattacks failed. By the evening, Hill 609 was American ground. It would never again be German. The official history of the United States Army in the Mediterranean Theater, written by George F. Howe and published by the Center of Military History, calls Hill 609 the American Army's coming of age. Omar Bradley, who had taken over the 2nd Corps from Patton 2 weeks earlier, would later write of the 34th Division at that hill that no one would ever again question its courage. He meant something specific by that judgment. He meant that the Green Men of November 1942 had become professionals. He meant that they had learned how to use their tools. And he meant, more than anything else, that they had learned how to use their guns. Tunis fell on May 7, 1943. The remaining Axis forces in Africa, hemmed against the sea on Cap Bon, surrendered on May 13. 250,000 prisoners marched into Allied captivity. It was, in raw numbers of men taken at surrender, a larger haul than Stalingrad. The Mediterranean was an Allied lake. Sicily was next. Then Italy, then Normandy, and then, eventually, the Rhine. Through every campaign that followed, the system that had been tested in the Tunisian valleys grew more efficient, more lethal, more refined. By the time of the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, the American Fire Direction Center had become so swift that an entire corps of artillery could be massed on a single point in less than 10 minutes. The technique of synchronizing the impact of every shell from every battery to land at the same instant, called time on target, had been developed by the British Royal Artillery in the Western Desert in late 1941 and early 1942. American gunners refined it and adopted it at scale through 1943 and 1944, until it shattered German defences at St. Lo, at Morton, and at the Bulge. By the time Major General Fritz Bayerlein, the man who had been Rommel's chief of staff in Africa and who now commanded the Panzer Lehr Division in Normandy, watched what American artillery could do in one summer afternoon at the start of Operation Cobra, he wrote that his men had felt as if they were under a moving carpet of bombs. He had, he told an interrogator afterward, never imagined that an army could bring such weight of fire to bear so quickly on a single piece of ground. He had imagined it, perhaps, in Tunisia. He had simply not known how far the Americans would carry it. What about the man whose name began this story? What did Erwin Rommel actually admit, in writing, about the gunners who had stopped him at Thala and again, by proxy, at El Getar? Rommel never returned to Africa. After his sick leave in the spring of 1943, he was given other commands. He fortified the Atlantic Wall. He commanded Army Group B in Normandy. He was wounded in a strafing attack on July 17, 1944. And in October of that year, implicated in the conspiracy to kill Adolf Hitler, he was forced to take poison rather than face a people's court that would have destroyed his family. Before he died, he had been writing. He had been writing in pencil, in a soldier's notebook, the chapter that would become his post-war verdict on the war he had not been allowed to win. The fullest English version of his writings appeared in 1953, edited by the British military historian Basil Liddell Hart, with the cooperation of Rommel's widow Lucy and his old chief of staff Fritz Bayerlein. In a chapter that the editors titled "The Sky Has Grown Dark," on page 523, Rommel wrote about the Americans whom he had fought in Tunisia. He wrote that they had had to pay a stiff price for their experience, but that the price had brought rich dividends. He wrote that even at that early stage, the American generals had shown themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. He wrote that one had to wait until the Patton Army in France to see, as he put it, the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare. Earlier in the same body of writings, he had said something else about the men he had fought at Kasserine. He wrote that the Americans were not yet, in February 1943, the equals of the veteran British Eighth Army. But, he wrote, they made up for their inexperience by their far better and more plentiful equipment and by their tactically more flexible command. The phrase tactically more flexible command is, in the end, the highest praise a German field marshal of the old school could give to a foreign army. He was not talking about the bravery of individual soldiers, though he praised that elsewhere. He was not talking about the grand strategy, which he considered a different question. He was talking about the moment of contact, the moment when a forward observer on a ridge spoke into a radio handset, and 90 seconds later, 50 howitzers 10 miles to the rear sent 40 rounds into the air. He was talking, in other words, about the American Fire Direction Center, even though he did not know its name. Hans von Luck, who had commanded a reconnaissance battalion under Rommel in Africa and who would later command panzer regiments in Normandy and on the Eastern Front, wrote in his memoir Panzer Commander that the Americans, once they had absorbed the lessons of Kasserine, adapted immediately to a changed situation and fought with great doggedness. Bayerlein himself, in the manuscripts he wrote for the United States Army Historical Division after the war, granted that American artillery had, by mid-1943, become an instrument that German divisions could not match in mass or in coordination. These were not propaganda admissions. These were notes by professional soldiers, written in defeat to other professional soldiers, about a craft that all of them respected. Today, much of that history is preserved in a few specific places. The Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, has a small museum where one of the original M2A1 howitzers from the Tunisian campaign sits on a concrete pad in the open air. The 1st Division Museum at Cantigny Park in Wheaton, Illinois, holds the records of the Big Red 1 Division artillery, including the firing logs from El Getar. The American Battle Monuments Commission maintains the North Africa American Cemetery at Carthage, in Tunisia, where 2,841 Americans lie buried, many of them artillerymen. Their graves face east, toward the dawn that broke the back of the 10th Panzer Division on March 23, 1943. The story of those gunners is rarely told as it should be told, because the men who made it possible were the kind of men America has always produced in great numbers and remembered with great difficulty. They were not gifted in obvious ways. They were not warriors in the romantic sense. Most of them did not want to be where they were. They wanted to be home, on farms and in workshops and at college desks, scattered across the United States. What they had, instead of a warrior's instinct, was a clerk's discipline. They could compute a logarithm. They could read a map. They could follow a checklist. They could keep their slide rules dry in the rain. And when a forward observer's voice crackled through the static in the headset, they could move a 33-pound shell, or a 95-pound shell, through the air across miles of African mountain, and put it within 15 feet of a target they had never seen. That capacity, that trained American capacity to make complicated machinery work in combat, is what Rommel saw and what he wrote about. He had, in his career, fought against the French divisions of 1940, against the British cavalry and armour of the desert, and against the South African, New Zealand, Indian, and Australian soldiers who had bled the Afrika Korps from Tobruk to El Alamein. He had killed many of them. He had been killed by none of them. What stopped him, in the end, in Africa, was not a panzer commander as gifted as he was, because there was none. It was an American technical system that he could not match. He recognized it. He wrote it down. And he gave the men who built that system, the gunners and the lieutenants and the fire direction center clerks and the brigadier generals named Mr. Chips and Red, a place in his last writings. So when you remember the Tunisian campaign, do not remember only the names that travel easily. Do not remember only Patton and Bradley and Eisenhower. Remember the names that have nearly faded. Remember Stafford Leroy Irwin, who drove his guns 735 miles in 4 days and broke a Panzer Field Marshal's offensive on a single February morning. Remember Clift Andrus, the pipe-smoking chess player who set the trap at El Guetar that killed 30 German tanks before breakfast. Remember Carlos Brewer and Orlando Ward, who built, at a windswept post in Oklahoma, the gunnery system that won them their war. Remember Leslie J. McNair, who fought no battles himself but who built the army that fought them all, and who died, on July 25, 1944, of friendly fire from American bombers at the start of Operation Cobra, the operation his own gunners would make famous. Remember also the men whose individual names did not survive in any history book. Among the unnamed thousands were the section chiefs who lost their hearing at Kasserine and went home to small towns scattered across America. There were the lieutenants who calculated firing data on slide rules by candlelight in Tunisian farmhouses and went on, after the war, to live in trades and classrooms and offices that no public record marks. There were the corporals who hauled 33-pound shells through 9-hour fire missions on the morning of March 23, 1943, and who lived out the rest of their days, unrecorded by history. They have no individual monuments. Their names appear only on company rosters, on yellowed firing logs at the 1st Division Museum in Cantigny Park, and on the white marble headstones of the North Africa American Cemetery at Carthage, where 2,841 of their comrades lie. They are the ones who earned what Rommel wrote down. The Desert Fox, in his last notebooks, was honest about them. He had paid them, in his own words, a debt of professional respect, and he had paid that debt in the only currency he knew, which was the ink of a soldier's pen. He wrote what he saw. He saw an army that had learned, faster than he had thought possible, how to use the tools democracy had given it. He saw, behind the smoke of El Guetar and Hill 609 and the road to Tunis, the outline of the army that would, in the years to come, drive a different field marshal from a different country across a different continent and into the rubble of Berlin itself. And he understood, as professional soldiers always understand, that the difference between him and them was not courage, it was not skill, it was not even leadership, it was the system, it was Fort Sill. It was the fire direction center. It was the long grey column of American howitzers winding through the Algerian night, headed for a pass behind Thala, where 735 miles of bad road and 4 days without sleep ended in a barrage that broke a legend. That is what Erwin Rommel admitted about American artillery in North Africa. He admitted, in writing, that he had been outmatched. The men who had built the system that defeated him, the unspectacular American gunners with their slide rules and their firing charts, were the soldiers he had not seen coming. The German army, whose pre-war doctrine had assumed it would always have the advantage in the speed and weight of fire, had finally met an army that had built that advantage into its very bones. The Americans had not been faster soldiers than the Germans. They had been better organized, better connected, and in the deepest sense, better engineered for the war that the 20th century had become. And in admitting it, with the honesty that even his enemies always granted him, Rommel gave the men who had taught him that lesson the only monument that mattered to them. He gave them the recognition of a soldier who had spent his entire life, since his first wound on the Western Front in 1914, learning the trade of war. The man who had once been the most feared general in the world had stood across a Tunisian valley from young Americans he had not believed could fight, and they had taught him, in 3 months, that he had been wrong. That is the story their grandchildren should know. That is the story their country has nearly forgotten. And that is the story, in the language of the men who lived it, of how the United States Army first walked, then ran, then thundered into the historical memory of a continent that had not, until 1943, taken it seriously. The howitzers fell silent 83 years ago. The men who served them are nearly all gone, but the system they proved in those passes still stands. And the Desert Fox's notebook, in pencil, in a careful officer's hand, still bears their witness.